Although a significant number of German U-boats would fall into the hands of the Allies by the closing stages of World War II, only a handful were ever caught out in the open sea. The circumstances behind their capture having been well hidden behind a veil of secrecy, up until many years after the conflict had ended. A series of events which often featured instances of individual heroism, but that also sometimes demonstrated the more sorrowful aspects of human behaviour. The Type 7 model was the most highly produced U-boat of World War II, with the original versions of this model having already been in service prior to the conflict. With war having been declared, a huge uplift in production of these vessels was ordered in order to try and facilitate German superiority on the high seas. Issues that had been experienced from the first two incarnations of the design were amended, which resulted in the Type 7C, of which 568 would be commissioned before the war's end. Amongst their number was U-570, which had been launched in May of 1941, before then being posted to the 3rd U-boat flotilla at Trondheim. Due to the frantic pace to train crews for the new submarines, experienced sailors were stripped from active vessels and spread thinly around the newer models. But the same workaround could not be applied to the commanding officers of these ships, meaning that most went to sea under the command of inexperienced captains. U-570 would be a case in point, at the time she was dispatched on her first wartime patrol in August of 1941. Of her 48 crew, only 7 had previously been to sea, with most of her senior officers having been transferred to the submarine service from surface postings. Still, on the morning of 24th of August, she set sail from her base in Norway, one of 16 submarines ordered to sink Allied shipping that would be passing the coast of Iceland. It had soon become apparent that most of the submarine's crew were struggling with their new posting, with a high ratio of seasickness. As a result, U-570 spent most of the 4-day transit out to her patrol areas submerged, in order to try and alleviate the suffering that her crew were experiencing. On the morning of 27th of August, Captain Hans Joachim Ramlow gave orders for the submarine to ventilate itself. After surfacing and conducting a visual check of the surrounding area, Ramlow had then returned to the bridge, leaving Lieutenant Bernhard Berndt in charge of the conning tower. But moments later, Berndt was sounding the alarm after an enemy aircraft broke out of the clouds above and lined up on the submarine for a bombing run. As chaos consumed the U-boat, the pilot of the approaching RAF Hudson attempted to drop his depth charges, only for his firing mechanism to fail. He could only watch on helplessly as the sailors below him hurried into the submarine's conning tower, moments before it slipped down beneath the waves. And as the crew of U-570 congratulated themselves on what presented as a lucky escape, they had little idea that additional RAF aircraft were now being called into the area in order to find them. Seemingly content with how his men had handled the attack, Captain Ramlow then retired to his quarters, once again leaving Lieutenant Berndt in charge of the bridge. He was still to be found there at approximately 10:30 that morning, when the U-boat again surfaced in order to try and complete her ventilation procedure. But on this occasion, the bridge crew had failed to conduct an effective check of the skies above, instantly falling prey to a second RAF Hudson that had stumbled across her. On this occasion, there were no mechanical failures, and moments later, the diving U-570 was straddled by 4 depth charges. The resultant detonations caused little structural damage to the submarine, beyond the release of a small amount of chlorine gas from its batteries. But that would prove sufficient to panic Ramlow, who immediately gave orders to surface in an effort to try and vent the gas. As U-570 once again appeared, and her crew began to exit through the hatches, the pilot of the Hudson mistakenly believed they were attempting to reach the vessel's anti-aircraft gun. causing him to immediately conduct a series of 4 low-level passes, during which he repeatedly strafed the deck of the submarine with his machine guns. With 5 of his men now wounded, and convinced that his commander was filling below him with poisonous gas, Ramlo hurried back to the conning tower, emerging with a large sheet of white map paper to signal he would surrender. Hardly able to believe what he was seeing, the Hudson's pilot immediately called for additional ships and planes to come and support him. The aircraft then continued to remain on station, circling around above the motionless submarine until it was later relieved by a second plane. Within hours, 2 Royal Navy trawlers had arrived and were on the scene, having been the nearest Allied ships who could respond to the request. As they did so, their crews stared with some suspicion at the German sailors lined up on the deck of the U-boat, which was silently floating on the surface a short distance away. Assuming the sub must be too damaged to submerge, they also feared a trap, and ordered the Germans to remain on deck, stating they would open fire if there was any movement. This threat, although somewhat against the rules of war, proved sufficient to prevent any issue, until 2 naval destroyers then arrived, who took the submarine and its crew into custody. With the senior officers having been removed, a skeleton crew was placed aboard the submarine, and now under British control, it set sail for Iceland. Having successfully arrived, it was then beached and subjected to a rigorous testing procedure by Royal Naval officers. In the meantime, the majority of the crew were returned to Britain and dispersed around a number of Kriegsmarine POW camps, and it was only at this point that events took a somewhat particularly sinister turn. The main holding facility for captured German sailors in England at the time was situated at Grisdale Hall in Lancashire, and it was here that the officers of U-570 were sent, not realising that rumours of their capture were already circulating amongst their fellow prisoners. Amongst those already in residence at the camp was Captain Otto Kretschmer, the commanding officer of U-99, which had been sunk 5 months earlier. A noted U-boat ace and German national hero, Kretschmer was disgusted by the circumstances in which the crew of U-570 had allegedly allowed their ship to be taken intact, prompting him to convince his fellow officers to convene an official court of honour and to question the sub-senior staff when they arrived. With Ramlo having been retained in London for an extended period of questioning, it therefore fell to the hapless Lieutenant Burnt to justify the surrender of the ship to his superiors. The illicit court was held in secret at the hall the day after he arrived, consisting of cross-examination from a panel of 3 Kriegsmarine officers. For his part, Kretschmer did not participate in the protest, fearing his notoriety would draw attention to the British authorities. The proceedings were short and brutal, with Burnt repeatedly asked why he hadn't relieved Ramlo of his command and scuttled the ship. When he could offer no real answer, Burnt was convicted of cowardice and told he would be kept under unofficial confinement by the other prisoners, and that when their nation ultimately went on to win the war, he would be returned to Germany and formally prosecuted for his actions, an outcome that for a number of reasons would never come to pass. For the next few days, the young naval lieutenant found his movements around the camp restricted by his peers, until he was unexpectedly summoned before a second secret council, again hidden from the Allied authorities. Burnt was informed that U-570 had now been returned from Iceland to the UK mainland and was allegedly docked only 25 miles away, in Barrow-in-Furness. He was further informed that in order to restore his lost honour and to avoid any future charges, he would need to escape from the camp and sabotage the sub. Despite the insanity of this proposal, which involved breaking out of one Allied camp and into another, with no means to achieve his objective, Burnt agreed to the demand. A set of civilian clothes and identity papers were hurriedly produced, neither of which would pass close scrutiny, but it was hoped would enable him to transit outside the camp. He was then issued with a cover story that he was a Dutch sailor returning from shore leave in Liverpool, before he was led to the perimeter fence. With the distraction underway, Burnt was helped through a section of wire that had been freshly cut, before being sent on his way. A mere 2 miles from the base, he was stopped and interrogated by a passing Home Guard patrol. And when it became clear his story was not being believed, the German officer tried to make a run for it, to nearby trees, only to be shot in the back by one of his captors, dying a short time later, before a local doctor that had been called could administer treatment to his injury. The sudden and brutal death of their fellow officer shocked the prisoners at Grisdale Hall, who quickly attempted to atone for their actions. Kretschmer himself asked the dead man be buried with full military honours, a request that was granted by the camp commander. A week later, he and 11 other officers attended a cemetery in Hawkshead, where Lieutenant Burnt was laid to rest. The Royal Navy providing the burial party with a guard of honour and a white naval ensign to cover the solitary coffin. But this act in no way cooled the attitude of the German officers towards Ramlow, who was informed upon his arrival at Grisdale Hall he too would be facing a court of honour. This time, news of the planned trial was leaked to the British, who quickly transferred Ramlow to a Luftwaffe camp some distance away, where he remained for the rest of the war. As for the U-570, despite Winston Churchill's personal plea that it be used as a propaganda tool, the decision was instead made to commission it into the Royal Navy. Once the sub's code books had been analysed and her systems fully assessed, she was renamed as HMS Graf. The name chosen as the letter G represented the fact that she was a captured German boat. During the next 2 years, HMS Graf completed 3 active war patrols, before being decommissioned due to a lack of spare parts and sent for scrap. On the 20th of March 1944, whilst being towed to the Clyde docks in order to be broken up, her tow rope broke and the submarine sank off Cool Point on the west coast of Scotland. Lying in only several metres of water, for several years it was still possible during some tides to see the wreck, but several instances of theft and the severe storms of the area have since removed any visible part of the wreck from public view. Captain Ramlow would survive his captivity, going on to pass away many years after the end of the war, in June of 1967. He never revealed why he surrendered his ship, without making any apparent effort to prevent the Allies from taking custody of it. Nor has it ever been made fully clear what it was that persuaded Bernhard Burnt to agree to undertake an impossible mission with no possible chance of success. It would not be until many years later that the sad story of U-570 would ever come to the public's attention, and when it did so, it left nothing behind but a legacy of unanswered questions about the traumatizing effects that warfare can exert upon the depths of the human soul.